it hadn't happened since 1997. Last month, the United States decertified Colombia. That means Washington no longer views Bogotá as a partner in the war on drugs, thanks to an annual process in which the U.S. executive branch submits a list of countries to Congress it considers cooperative in counter-narcotic efforts. This time, Colombia didn't make the list. The decertification was one of the latest in a series of tense episodes for the once sterling bilateral relationship. The friction between the two countries' presidents, Donald Trump in the United States and Gustavo Petro in Colombia, was on full display during the week of the UN General Assembly in New York in September. In his speech in front of the body, Petro criticized Trump's policies from the Caribbean to Gaza.
En esa mortandad de la humanidad, Trump no solo deja que caigan misiles contra los jóvenes en el Caribe, no solo encarcela y encadena migrantes contra niños, jóvenes, mujeres y viejos en Gaza. Se hace cómplice del genocidio porque es genocidio y hay
And then, days later, after Petro joined a protest on the streets of Manhattan, this happened.
The U.S. State Department says it will cancel the visa of Colombian President Gustavo Petro over what it calls his reckless and incendiary actions in New York. Petro stood on a city street on Friday urging U.S. soldiers to disobey the orders of President Trump and obey the orders of humanity.
This is Carin Zissis of ASCOA Online. In this episode of Latin American Focus, we're talking U.S.-Colombia ties at a time when Petro's presidency is waning.
Now, the U.S. administration, my view, is they are looking at the relationship as something that will transcend Petro, and that is far too important to sour on account of comments made by a president who's on the way out.
That's Sergio Guzmán, co-founder and director of Colombia Risk Analysis. He joined me for a conversation in Washington during a tricky time for Colombia. Aside from a rift with its closest ally, Colombia's security situation is worsening. The fiscal deficit is expanding, and the healthcare system is struggling. And an election is around the corner, with the presidential ballot scheduled for May 2026. Roughly 75 potential candidates are hoping to compete for the prize. We may not have time to run through every candidate, but in this episode, Sergio and I cover the mood ahead of the 2026 elections, the Trump-Petro troubles, Colombia's relationship with China, and more. Thank you for joining us, wherever you're tuning in. We've got listeners everywhere from Nashville to Medellin to Athens to Perth. So don't forget to subscribe to and share Latin American Focus on Apple, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Sergio,
Yes.
it is so great to be with you. For all of our listeners, Sergio is the director and co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis. He's been with us before on the podcast, and we're very lucky today to have him here in Washington talking with us in person. Welcome, Sergio, to Latin American Focus again.
Oh, Karen, it's great to be back. I look forward to our conversation.
We have a lot to cover today, and we're talking today about U.S.-Colombia relations. So let's get right into it. For months, we've been seeing heightened tensions between Washington and Bogotá. The Trump administration just recently revoked Gustavo Petro's visa after the president joined a pro-Palestinian demonstration in New York. That came just days after the Trump administration decertified Colombia. We're going to talk a little bit later about that, for failing to reach its counter-narcotics obligations. And then in recent days, Petro said that one of the vessels the U.S. had bombed in the southern Caribbean may have been Colombian and that Colombian citizens may have been killed. So those are just a few of the points between the two countries. All of this is remarkable when we think of these two countries that have long been seen as being very close allies. Colombia, some is being viewed as the U.S.'s closest ally in Latin America. Give us your view. Where do relations stand? Is it as bad as it looks?
Well, that's, a tall order and quite a few things. First to clarify, Petro didn't get his visa revoked because he participated in a pro-Palestinian protest. Petro got his visa revoked because he tried to get U.S. service members to disobey Donald Trump's orders. And that's calling for an insurrection. And in a way, the U.S. has been acting with some restraint with President Petro on account of a very strong bilateral relationship that exists. And you saw that when they issued decertification with a national interest waiver, and how they mentioned the strong relationship that the United States has with the Colombian police, with the Colombian armed forces, with local governments, and how that relationship really transcends the hiatus that we're in because of the poor relations between our presidents. And so it's important to put in context, where Petra's at right now in terms of his presidency at its dawn, contrasting with where Donald Trump is with his presidency, at the start of his term. And President Petro has less than 10 months left in office. He is looking to insert himself in the 2026 presidential election one way or another. And he's also angling for what his post presidency is going to look like. And if we look at what he envisions himself as, he is, the last Aureliano, right? The guy who charges at the firing squad, the person who is leading the just cause, even though it may be a lost cause, right? And so this crevice issue of Palestine is very useful for him. I'm not saying that it's not genuine, but it allows him to insert himself in a global conversation, right? Same as when he has been leading some discussions on the environment and some discussions on oil and gas and some discussions on global taxation and some discussions on global inequality, right? And some discussions on drug policy reform. But if you see the pattern, there's no progress in any of those things. They're all narrative elements that contribute to creating the legend of Gustavo Petro. That's the context in which these comments are made, and that's the context in which Petro is approaching the bilateral relation. Now, the US administration, my view, is they are looking at the relationship as something that will transcend Petro, and that is far too important to sour on account of comments made by a president who's on the way out, by a president who is deeply unpopular. Now, there are things to manage in the relationship, and they seem to be managed by the bureaucracy and by the Secretary of State in a way that portrays the seriousness of what is going on, and perhaps with an eye on 2026 to recover some of the trust and some of the elements. Now, China is not going to wait till 2026 to make a move. Other countries are trying to pull at Colombia in different directions, and so is President Petro, to unplug us from our very deep-seated relation with the United States and plug us into a new sort of multipolar order where we're part of the BRICS, or we're a country that's striving to balance out some of the global power equation.
We're gonna get more into China. I want to ask one question. You touched on decertification. For some of our listeners, because there's a lot going on in the Americas in general, that's a process that involves the fact that each year the U.S. government must certify to Congress which major drug-producing or transit countries are cooperating fully with U.S. counter-narcotics policies. Now, we've seen a huge increase in cocaine production in the past couple of years in Colombia, and this has been attributed by Trump to Petro's policies to instead of focus on eradication, to do some crop substitution, and his shift in drug policy overall. This is the first time that Colombia has been decertified since 1997, but we know that decertification can come with cuts in aid, stresses on diplomatic ties, all kinds of things, and yet the U.S. opted instead to have a waiver that means that the aid and the assistance stays in place. This seems to go back to what you said about the importance that Washington is placing on relations between the two countries, regardless of Petro. And I'm curious, does decertification matter in that case?
This was the most benevolent version of decertification we could have received, in the sense that it made very clear the statement that their disagreement was with President Petro and with the way he's conducting drug policy, extradition policy, and the misgivings of the total peace policy that President Petro is trying to put forward. And not that the U.S. is giving up on Colombia as an ally or the Colombian institutions as holding democratic values or the Colombian local governments, and especially not the Colombian military and police that have fought side by side with the U.S. since Korea, right? Colombia continues to believe it's a foundational partner of the West and not just, a Latin American hang-on country to that worldview. So in a sense, I think the U.S. wants to be very gentle with how it addresses Colombia, not just not to upset Gustavo Petro, but also to respect and value a 200-year-old relation.
Mm-hmm. Colombia plays a very important role in South America, and we've seen heightened concerns about violence, organized crime in the region. You can really see it in the context of neighboring Ecuador, which has seen skyrocketing violence. We see increasing tensions, obviously, between the United States and Venezuela. What does the current state of U.S.-Colombian relations mean for these security concerns in the region, particularly given, for example, Petro's comments in recent days that the U.S. has been attacking Colombian vessels? Where does Colombia sit in this relationship sit in terms of regional security relations?
So one of the most important regional security issues is organized crime. And that is central to the drug trafficking economy. And the illicit trafficking routes from the south to the north all go through Colombia, which produces, over 2/3 of the cocaine that is consumed in the United States, but also has a huge share of the cocaine that is produced globally and exported to South America, to Africa, to Europe, to Asia, etc. So for a very long time, the U.S. drug policy has been to contain supply and the flow of drugs to their markets and their economies. And President Petro sustains that that's not working. So he's been wanting to change the way that Colombia and the U.S. Collaborate, moving away from forced eradication and aerial eradication towards an interdiction and developmental approach. But that doesn't seem to be working because the organized armed criminal organizations in Colombia are stronger now than when President Petro took office, are producing more cocaine now than when President Petro took office, are a greater danger to the rule of law and the territorial control by the Colombian armed forces and police than they were before Petro took office. So this erosion hasn't necessarily gone unnoticed. And despite the multiple attempts by subsequent U.S. administrations to get Colombia to progress and to use the legitimate use of force to defend its citizens, that has been stopgap by President Petro on account of his ongoing negotiations with the ELN, with the Clan del Golfo, with the Comuneros del Sur, so on and so forth. And so I think patience with Petro's total peace strategy has worn thin, not without due reason necessarily. And I think that that is also something that, perhaps is not going to be ignored by a future Colombian administration. But as I say, it's still an open election.
The election is very close, and yet if we look at some of the things that are happening in the region, it's quite near. We have had this uptick in tensions in the Caribbean. We've talked a little bit about the attacks on these vessels. Um, and yet you've also referred to this relationship that Washington has of maintaining its relationship and its ties with the military in Colombia. What do you think when you have, in some ways, this sort of two-part relationship that's happening between the United States and Colombia? What would happen in a situation where we saw greater escalation in, for example, the Caribbean, or an uptick in conflict between the United States and Venezuela? If we saw, again, an uptick in an exodus from Venezuela as a result of that, or some sort of a worst case, what do you think would happen?
Well, that's a very difficult hypothetical to answer, not least because both leaders in both countries are known to improvise on occasion in terms of their intent, their rhetoric, and their capacity. And so, in a way, we don't know how Petro may react, or we don't know how President Trump may react, or whether the proximity of the announcement by the Nobel Committee will have an influence on the psyche of both men who think that they deserve an accolade as such, right? What I can tell you is that the legality of the deployments and the attacks on these vessels is still deeply politicized matter within the United States. The international law implications of this are still going to be, we're going to see their effects for years to come. And obviously, this does not necessarily bode well for the domestic situation in either Venezuela and Colombia, or the cohesion of Latin America to respond politically to such an issue. So we're in very delicate waters, and we are also, in a hyper polarized, social media driven environment that makes it difficult for cooler heads to prevail in a situation like the one that we have. And it doesn't help when Colombia's foreign minister resigned to her own visa voluntarily. Like, this is when these diplomats should be here in Washington working things out with their counterparts. It doesn't help when, the U.S. Does not have a Senate confirmed ambassador to Colombia for now over, I think, 4 years, right? So all of these things add up, right? And that's when diplomacy is needed the most. That's when dialogue is needed the most, with respect and with, thinking about the longer term implications of this in the relationship.
To invite another big power into the room, you mentioned that China is not going to wait. We know that Petro went to China a few months ago. Colombia has joined the Belt and Road Initiative. There's an interest in joining BRICS. And so I'm wondering, how do you see this relationship between? I mean, after all, the United States is still Colombia's most important trade partner. To what degree is China making inroads in Colombia?
Well, I think China is eager to closen its ties to Colombia, and they see President Petro seems eager to do that as well. However, President Petro is not going to be able to just unplug Colombia from the US and plug it into China by signing a memorandum of understanding. Like, these ties are not just cultural or political, they're personal and they're business ties. For the EU CELAC meeting, Ernesto Samper, the former president of Colombia, tweeted that President Gabriel Boric took 60 members of the business community alongside him, and that President Lula took over 230 members of the business community alongside him to meet Chinese counterparts, whereas Petro took 0 members of the business community who he dislikes and who he calls slavers and oppressors with certain frequency. So the political relationship with China may be on a high note, but the business relationship with China is the one that's going to outlast Petro and succeed onto subsequent governments. And there's market advantages for Colombia to trade with China for their interests in infrastructure, in critical minerals, in ports, in technology, in retail, in manufacturing. Like, same as a very ambitious agenda we currently have with the United States on oil, coal, gas, telecoms, flowers, agricultural exports, produce, etc. The trade relationship with the United States is over $52 billion per year. The trade relationship with China is 17. So still, the US-Colombia relationship dwarfs any other bilateral relationship that Colombia may have. But that doesn't mean China's not intention to catch up and to do it quickly, right? It's not necessarily disadvantageous for Colombia to strengthen its relationship with China, but it has to be done in a well thought out, concerted way, right? And in the 10 months that Petro has left in office, that's not sufficient time to plan this out, to think it through. So we expect a lot of brazen rashness coming from Colombia in the next 10 months. And a lot of the countries that are part of the BRICS, like I mentioned, want to avoid, another country pulling out of the alliance, like Argentina. And our concern is that Colombia is not portraying itself as a serious partner who ought to be taken seriously and whose commitments in the international stage matter.
Now, you mentioned earlier that what you might describe as some of Petro's inflammatory statements, and I'm curious. We do have this big election year coming up in Colombia. You're talking about the fact that we can expect to see some more of these inflammatory and divisive statements. You've described a sense of polarization. I have a question for you. We've had this idea, and we hear that um, with this upcoming election, there's an idea that Colombia is going to shift to the right. You have some very interesting analysis that you've put out that points out that there are 75 potential candidates. We're looking at a very polarized race. We're just getting underway, and we know that the left coalition, of which Petro's party is a member, is about to hold primaries at the end of this month. So even though the election might be in May, things are happening fast. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the election, what you're seeing, this crowded field, and what, in addition, this leftist primary means as sort of a starting point?
Absolutely. So the election to succeed Petro, where he can't run, is underway. There's over 75 candidates. There's no polling until November because it was disallowed by a law that passed at the end of the last legislature in June. So the data from polling is not reliable at this point. So we're basically in a dark cavern about knowing where this is going. What we do know is that if we wanted to look at the different buckets of presidential candidates, there are those on the left that range from, Petro supporters with ardent passion, and those that are much more transactional opportunists, politically speaking. In the center, you have people who are traditionally aligned with independent or alternative movements or have run unsuccessfully in the past. And in the right, you have some technocrats, but also some radical people that are looking to capitalize on security populism to win in 2026. And then there are those that want, a drastic return of Colombia to policies that emerged in 2002. And they look at the country as needing a savior of some sorts. What we argue is the Colombian electorate is very fatigued, but it's not necessarily entirely opposed to President Petro. So what we've said is that, if the left wants to win, it has to make concessions. So it can't necessarily victoriously elect the most ardently pro-Petro government. That the center has to choose somebody quickly and run a united front, and that the right has to understand that just being anti-incumbent and anti-Petro is not going to get them across the finish line. Now, I can say that they're not going to listen because they're all running their own rat race to be victorious in their own buckets. Added to the fact that there's virtually no polling, and until December 8th, we won't get parties to submit party lists for Congress. So nobody between now and December has any real incentives to drop out of the race on their own terms to join a bigger force. Now, this is the process. This is the political process. It will work itself out thereafter on March 8th, when we have an inter-party primary between the different buckets and we have the congressional elections, moving on to May 31st, when we do have the first round of presidential elections. So we have time, but I want to sustain this election remains open for a number of reasons. First of which, President Petro is at 37% approval, which isn't great, but it's not Dina Boluarte's numbers, to be honest. And on the right, there is enthusiasm, but there's so much fragmentation as well. And so right now, the race is open, and a lot of people on the right are not being very critical of themselves, particularly as to the reasons why Petro was elected legitimately, right? People feel represented by a government that looks like them. There's a solid base of people who are loyal and committed to some of the things that President Petro is saying. Colombia's inequality continues to be a very significant source of social tension. And there's a very large component of young people who hear what Petro's arguments are on the environment or drugs or the issue of Palestine, and it resonates. So it's not empty words that are being thrown out into the ether. These are significant policy shifts from Colombia's traditional positions, and they seem to be working. So there needs to be a strong period of reflection in our body politic about the future. And that can't happen, with 39 political parties. That can't happen with a very fragmented field of candidates. That can't happen when, you lift a cup and there's a Colombian presidential candidate announcing that they're running, right? So they need to get serious. And time is running out.
I can't help but reflect on the fact that a few years ago, we saw very big protests in Colombia related to some of the issues that you mentioned around inequality, and so your response makes me think about what's happened in the past 5 years or so in the country. A lot of shifts and changes, and you mentioned that voters are fatigued. The Colombian voters are fatigued. And I'm curious, what exactly is fatiguing them? We know that we've seen some an uptick in violence. We've seen terrible political assassination. You mentioned inequality. What are voters concerned about, and why are they fatigued?
If you look at the majority of indicators suggest pessimism, right? People think the country's going in the wrong direction. They're dissatisfied with the economy. They're dissatisfied with security. They're dissatisfied with the environment. They're dissatisfied with healthcare. They're dissatisfied with corruption. They're dissatisfied with education. So all of it would suggest, Petro's doing a really poor job, yet his approval doesn't move. But by the way, none of those issues has a dominant lead over the rest. Contrast it with Argentina, for instance. The majority of Argentinians believed that inflation was a central issue in the election that led up to Javier Milei's election as president. Yes, right now, a plurality of Colombians believe that security is the most important issue, but it captures in those polls close to 20%. And then the others are peppered in there. So, the Colombian body politic and their attention is a little bit dispersed. And that way, there's not a dominant issue, right? Because if you said, security is the issue, then you'd see candidates who have strong security backgrounds leading the polls. And that's not what you see. If education was the central issue, you'd see candidates that have been proposing education for 30 years leading the polls. And that's not the case. If healthcare was the central issue, you'd see candidates who've been in positions of leadership in the healthcare sector leading the race, and they're not. And I'm intentionally not mentioning any of the candidates' names. So the Colombian electorate doesn't yet appear to know what it's looking for in a successor. And that makes the race much more open than it might appear.
So to bring it back to the main topic of this podcast, which is U.S.-Colombian relations, in elections, we tend to see Colombia or in other countries that some of the issues you mentioned are what drive voters. The economy, jobs, education, healthcare, violence, insecurity. Those tend to be the sorts of things that might drive voters one way or another. One thing that we often reflect on is that foreign policy in many countries isn't a driver. It isn't a decision maker for voters in an election. But I'm curious to know, how are U.S.-Colombia relations viewed in Colombia, and are they having an impact on the election at all?
Well, I think for many Colombians, the U.S. continues to be an aspirational destination, an aspirational partner, a country they want to look like, a country they want to be like. And there's, strong cultural and economic ties to back that up. But the polling for President Trump in Colombia is largely unfavorable. Having said that, in other countries like Brazil or Canada or even places in Europe, Trump has weighed on voters' minds, or is weighing on voters' minds as they head to the polls or they rethink about their priorities. Petro's animosity towards Trump may be looking to get some sort of a Trump bump ahead of 2026. But it's unclear, like you said, Carin, that foreign policy will be at the top of mind for many of the presidential candidates. In fact, on the 29th of October, Colombia Risk Analysis is hosting a presidential debate on foreign policy, because foreign policy tends to be on the sidelines of their agenda, and we want to at least try to put it forward a little bit and have them start thinking about these things. Start thinking about Colombia's geopolitical position, about our relationship with the U.S., about our relationship with China, about our views about multilateralism, about how the foreign ministry should work or be organized, and ambassadorial appointments and things like that tend to be boring and also tend to be left behind in the wake of some very serious concerns that voters have, which foreign policy is not among them.
Great. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more about that debate. You talked about the fact that while Petro doesn't have strong levels of popularity, in fact, has a relatively high disapproval rating, he still has not seen his approval go down despite this voter fatigue, despite voter frustration. I'm curious, one thing that we did see in the case of Brazil is when the United States and Brazil began to have a conflict over tariffs in particular, Lula struck back and became very vocal, and we actually saw his approval rating go up in Brazil. I'm wondering, do you think that Petro is sort of looking for a similar sort of bump? Is he, and if so, is it working?
I think Petro's trying to replicate some of that effect, but part of the problem is he's not on the ballot. Another person is on the ballot whose positions on the U.S. are not altogether clear. Petro is trying to consolidate that electorate, and he may be doing a good job at it, but we don't know because we don't have any polls. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily suggest it's a losing argument, because Donald Trump, according to the late polls, is not well liked amongst the majority of Colombians. So that is likely to have an effect, but the gravity of that effect is yet to be determined.
But Sergio, thank you for covering so much for this interview and giving us the broad strokes of the election coming up, US-Colombia relations, geopolitical issues for Colombia. It was such a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be back here.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Carin Zissis. This episode was produced by Chase Harrison with executive producer Luisa Leme. Additional production support was provided by Rafael de Osma. We're covering all of Latin America's elections, from the last races of 2025 to the big ones on the horizon in 2026. Check our website for poll trackers, candidate comparisons, and more. You can find other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast. Or write us an email telling us what you think at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share this episode and the show with other Latin America aficionados and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music in this podcast was performed for America Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. Check the episode notes to learn how to become a member of America Society and get preferential seating and concerts, as well as access to arts and cultural events. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members.